Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, today we are going to discuss about tradition and the individual talent. Summary in English. In this essay, T.S. Eliot gives us his views about the relation between tradition and the writing of poetry by individual poets in different periods. He establishes a close connection between tradition and the writing of successful poetry. A poet's work may remind us of his ancestors. It is a general tendency, says Eliot, to emphasize those aspects of the work of a poet in which he least resembles anyone else. In such aspects of his poetic work, we claim to find what is individual or what is the peculiar essence of that poet. We feel pleased with that poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We try to discover those qualities by which he can be differentiated from those poets who have lived and written poetry before him. In actual fact, says Eliot, the best and the most individual parts of a poet may be those in respect of which he reminds us of his ancestors, the dead poets. However, by tradition, Eliot does not mean that a poet should follow the ways of the preceding generation blindly, or imitate the successors of the writers of that generation. In other words, tradition does not mean repetition of what has been done before. Indeed, novelty is preferable to repetition. A poet has to work very hard if he is to benefit by tradition, because tradition is not a matter of automatic inheritance. Tradition involves the historical sense. The historical sense is almost indispensable to say one who wishes to devote his life to the writing of poetry. The historical sense means a perception of the pastness of the past, but it also at the same time means a perception of the presence of the past. In other words, a poet should have the feeling that the past did exist, and furthermore, that the past exists for him every now. The historical sense compels a poet to write not merely with an awareness of his own generation, but with the feeling that the whole of European literature from Homer, and within it the whole literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. The historical sense may therefore be defined as a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together. It is this sense which makes a poet traditional, and it is this sense which at the same time makes a poet most acutely conscious of his place in time and of his own existence in the present. No poet, Eliot goes on to say, has his complete meaning alone. In order to understand his significance and in order to appreciate him, we must understand his relation to the poets who have gone before him. No poet can be assessed or valued alone. He must be placed for contrast and comparison. Among the dead poets, when a new work of art is created, something happens to all the works of art which were created in the past. The works of art already in existence form an ideal order among themselves. This order is modified by the appearance of a new work of art among them. When the new work arrives, the whole existing order is altered, maybe to a very slight extent, As a consequence, the relations of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. This is the meaning of conformity between the old and the new. What needs to be recognized is that the past is altered by the present, as much as the present is directed by the past. A poet has therefore to realize that he is inevitable to be judged by the standards of the past. This does not mean that the poet has to be curbed or restricted by past standards, nor does this mean that he is to be judged as being better or worse than the dead or as being equal to them. Nor yet does this mean that he is to be judged by the principles formulated by past critics. This only means a comparison between his work and past works, a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. A new work is not expected merely to conform with the past works, because in that case it would not be new and would therefore not be a work of art, nor should a new work be new in the sense of taking no notice whatsoever of past works. A new work will be individual, though it will appear to conform, and it will conform though it appears to be individual. It is most unlikely that it will be one and not the other. Enlarging upon this idea of the relation of a poet to the past, Eliot says that the poet can neither take the past as a lump, not form himself wholly on one or two past poets whom he admires, nor form himself wholly upon one chosen period of literary history which attracts them. The poet must be very conscious of the main current, which does not at all flow always through the most famous names in literary history. He must be quite aware of the fact that art never improves, but that the material of art keeps changing. He must be aware that the mind of the nation is much more important than his own individual mind, and that the mind of the nation keeps changing, though this change is a development which does not discard anything on the way, which does not supersede either Shakespeare or Homer. This development is not an artistic improvement, though it may be a refinement, and though it is certainly a complication. The difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way, and to an extent which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. Eliot then proceeds to answer an objection which may be raised against his view of poetry. The objection is that his view demands a vast amount of erudition. This objection is, according to Eliot, not valid at all, as can be verified with a reference to the cases of any number of poets. While it is not necessary for a poet to possess excessive erudition, it is not desirable to put restraints upon his acquiring knowledge beyond the normal degree. What is necessary is that the poet must develop or acquire the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. This means a continual surrender of himself to something more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. This may be called a process of depersonalization. In this depersonalization, art may be said to approach the condition of science. Eliot next expresses the view that honest criticism and appreciation are directed not upon the poet but upon his work. What we find, he says, is a greater emphasis upon poets than upon poems. Having already pointed out the importance of the relation of a poem to other poems by other authors, and having thus suggested the idea of poetry as a living whole of all the poems that have ever been written, Eliot now points out the other aspect of his impersonal theory of poetry. This aspect is the relation of the poem to its author. The mind of the mature poet differs from that of the immature one by being a more finely perfected medium in which special are very varied. Feelings can freely enter into new combinations. The mind of the poet is a kind of catalyst. The experience, the elements which enter the presence of this catalyst are of two kinds: emotions and feeling. The effect of a work of art upon a person may be formed out of one emotion or may be a combination of several, and various feelings may be added to compose the final result. Or great poetry may be written without the direct use of any emotion whatever. It may be composed out of feelings only. Canto 15 of the Inferno is a working up of the emotion evident in the situation, but the effect, though single as that of any work of art, is obtained by considerable complexity of detail. A poet's mind, in fact, seizes and stores up numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound are present together. There are many ways in which such a combination takes place. What counts is the intensity of the artistic process or pressure under which the fusion or combination takes place. It is not the greatness or the intensity of the emotions, the components, which matters. The episode of Paolo and Francisca implies a definite emotion, but the intensity of the poetry is something quite different from whatever intensity in the supposed experience it may give the impression of. Great variety is possible in the process of transmutation of emotion. The Nightingale Ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale, but which the nightingale, partly perhaps because of its attractive name and partly because of its reputation, serves to bring together. The poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man or the personality may take no place in the poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may play little part in the man or the personality. Eliot then quotes a passage of poetry to show a combination of positive and negative emotions, an intensely strong attraction toward beauty and the equally intense fascination by the ugliness which is contrasted with it and which destroys it. The whole effect, the dominant tone of this passage, is due to the fact that a number of floating feelings have combined with the structural emotion to give us a new art emotion. It is not in these personal emotions, the emotions excited by particular events in his life, that the poet is in any way remarkable or interesting. His particular emotions may be simple or crude or flat. The emotion in his poetry will be a very complex thing. At the same time, it is a mistake to search for novelty in emotions, because this search often leads to eccentricity. The business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones and, in working them up into poetry, to express feelings which are no actual emotions at all. And he may express not only emotions with which he is familiar, but which he has never experienced. In view of this, the formula that poetry is the expression of emotion recollected in tranquility is not quite an accurate one, for it is neither emotion nor recollection nor tranquility in a real sense. It is a concentration and a new thing resulting from the concentration. It is a concentration which does not take place consciously or as a result of deliberation. This is of course not quite the whole story. There is a great deal in the writing of poetry which must be conscious and deliberate. In fact, the bad poet is usually unconscious where he ought to be conscious, and vice versa. Both errors tend to make him personal. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. Eliot concludes this essay by remarking that it is a commendable aim to divert interest from the poet to the poetry, because this would lead to a juster estimation of actual poetry, good and bad. There are many people who appreciate the expression of sincere emotion in poetry, and there is a smaller number of people who can appreciate technical excellence, but very few know when there is an expression of significant emotion which has its life in the poet and not in the history of the poet. The emotion of art is impersonal, and the poet cannot attain this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. The poet must too live in what is not merely the present, but the present moment of the past. He must be conscious not of what is dead, but of what is already living. The metaphysical poets. The phrase metaphysical poetry, says Eliot, has for a long time been used as a term of abuse or as the label of a quaint and pleasant taste. The question with which Eliot deals in this essay is to what extent the so-called metaphysical poets form a school or a movement, and how far this school or movement was a turning away from the main current of poetry. It is difficult, says Eliot, to find any precise use of metaphor, simile or other conceit, which is common to all the poets who are described as metaphysical and at the same time important enough as an element of style to isolate these poets as a group. Donne and often Cowley employ a device which is sometimes considered characteristically metaphysical. It is the elaboration contrasted with the condensation of a figure of speech to the furthest stretch to which ingenuity can carry it. Thus Cowley develops the commonplace comparison of the world to a chessboard through many stanzas in one of his poems. Donne develops in one of his poems a comparison of two lovers to a pair of compasses. But elsewhere we find, instead of the mere explication of the content of a comparison, a development by rapid association of thought, which required considerable mental agility on the part of the reader. At the same time, some of Donne's most successful and characteristic effects are obtained by brief words and sudden contrasts. There is, for instance, the following line: a bracelet of bright hair about the bone. Here the most powerful effect is produced by the sudden contrast of associations of bright hair and of bone. This telescoping of image and multiplied associations is characteristic of some of the dramatists of the period which Donne knew. Not to mention Shakespeare, it is frequent in Middleton, Webster and Tournier, and is one of the sources of the vitality of their language. Dr. Johnson said that in the words of the metaphysical poets, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Dr. Johnson meant that often the ideas are put together but not united, and of course enough examples may be found in the work of Cleveland to justify Dr. Johnson's charge. But then we should not forget that a degree of heterogeneity of material compelled into unity by the operation of the poet's mind is to be found everywhere in poetry. And Dr. Johnson's own poetry, we can find lines where the effect is due to a contrast of ideas, different in degree but the same in principle, as that which Johnson mildly condemned. Eliot then quotes some lines from a poem by George Herbert. These lines, says Eliot, would be immediately recognized as those of the metaphysical school, but there is nothing in these lines which fits Johnson's journal observations on the metaphysical poets. In his essay on Cowley, a good deal resides in the richness of association, which is at the same time borrowed from and given to the word becalmed, but the meaning is clear, the language simple and elegant, it as rule simple and pure. In the work of George Herbert, this simplicity is carried as far it can go. The structure of the sentences, on the other hand, is sometimes far from simple, but this is not a vice, it is a fidelity to thought and feeling. If so shrewd a critic as Johnson failed to define metaphysical poetry by its force, we can say, says Eliot, inquire whether we can assume that the poets of the 17th century were the direct and normal development of the preceding age. We have to ask, here we need to make the correction, TO2, ask whether the virtue of these poets was not something permanently valuable, something which subsequently disappeared but ought not to have disappeared. Dr. Johnson hits on one of the peculiarities of these poets when he observes that their attempts were always analytic, though Johnson would not agree that after the dissociation they succeeded in putting the material together again in a new unity. The dramatic words of later Elizabethan and early Jacobean poets expresses a degree of good, as it often is. In Chapman especially, there is direct sensuous apprehension of thought, or recreation of thought into feeling, which is exactly what we find in Donne. A definite change occurred after the time of the metaphysical poets. The difference between them and the major Victorian poets is the difference between the intellectual poet and the reflective poet. Tennyson and Browning are poets, and they think but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. A thought too, Donne was an experience. It modified his sensibility. When a poet's mind is perfectly equipped for its work, it is constantly amalgamating a disparate experience. The ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular, and fragmentary. The ordinary man falls in love or reads philosophy. These two experiences have nothing to do with each other or with the noise of the typewriter or the smell of cooking. But in the mind of the poet, such experiences are always forming new holes. The fact of the matter is that the metaphysical poets were the successors of the dramatists of the 16th century. They possessed a mechanism of sensibility which could devour any kind of experience. They are simple, artificial, difficult, or fantastic, as their predecessors were. Afterwards, a dissociation of sensibility began, from which English poetry has never recovered. This dissociation was aggravated by the influence of the two most powerful poets of the 17th century, Milton and Dryden. Subsequently, the language went on and in some respects improved. The best poetry of Collins, Gray, Johnson, and even Goldsmith satisfies some of our fastidious demands better than that of the metaphysical poets. But while the language became more refined, the feeling became more crude. The feeling, the sensibility expressed in Gray's elegy and in the poetry of Tennyson and Browning is cruder than that in Andrew Marvell's poem The Coy Mistress. The sentimental age began in the 18th century and continued. The poets revolted against the ratiocinative, the descriptive. They thought and felt by fits unbalanced. They reflected. Occasionally there are in the poetry of Shelley and Keats signs of a struggle toward unification of sensibility, but Shelley and Keats died prematurely, and Tennyson and Browning ruminated or reflected. The so-called metaphysical poets have, like other poets, various faults, but they were at best engaged in the task of trying to find the verbal equivalent for states of mind and feeling, and this means that they are more mature and more lasting than later poets who possessed a literary ability of no lesser degree. Poets in our civilization have necessarily to write poetry which is difficult. Our civilization offers a great variety and complexity. This variety and complexity, operating upon a refined sensibility, must produce results which are various and complex. The poet in our times must therefore become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, and more indirect in order to force language into his meaning. Hence we get from the modern poet something which looks very much like the conceit of the metaphysical poets. We get in fact a method curiously similar to the method of those poets, similar also in its use of obscure words and of simple phrasing. Some of the modern French poets are nearer to the school of Donne than any modern English poet, but poets more classical than they have the same essential quality of transmuting ideas into sensations, of transforming an observation into a state of mind. In French literature, the great master of the 17th century and the great master of the 19th century, namely Racine and Baudelaire, respectively, are in some ways very much like each other. These, the greatest two masters of diction, are also the greatest two psychologists, the most curious explorers of the soul, two of the greatest masters of diction in the English language. Milton and Dryden achieved their poetic triumphs with a complete disregard of the soul. Those who object to the artificiality of Milton or Dryden sometimes advise poets look into their hearts while writing, but looking into one's heart is not enough. Racine or Donne looked into a good deal more than the heart. A poet must look into the cerebral cortex, the nervous system, and the digestive tracts. In conclusion, Eliot says that the metaphysical poets Donne, Crashaw, Vaughan, Herbert, and Lord Herbert, Marvel King, Cowley, and his best are in the direct current of English poetry, and these poets should therefore be judged by this standard. They have been praised a good deal in terms which imply limitations, because they are described as metaphysical or witty, quaint or obscure, though at their best they do not have these attributes more than other serious poets. On the other hand, we must not reject Dr. Johnson's criticism of them without first understanding fully the Johnsonian canons of taste. We must remember, for instance, that by which Johnson means something more serious than we usually mean today. We must also remember that Johnson chiefly finds fault with the main offenders, Cowley and Cleveland, in his criticism of the versification of the metaphysical poets. We must remember in what a narrow discipline he was trained. Though trained excellently well, we must also keep in mind the fact that these poets differ among themselves in kind and degree. They represent a wide range, from the massive music of Donne to the faint, pleasing tinkle of Aurelian Townshend. Dear students, the question of tradition and the individual talent summary in English ends here. Let's meet in the next video. Take very much care. Allah Hafiz.